The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Katie Morrison stood at the medication station of Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department, her trembling hands arranging pre-filled syringes in precise rows. 6 months. She had been invisible here for exactly 6 months, and the tremor in her fingers was something she could not control when no one was watching. She was 43 years old and lived in a studio apartment 3 blocks from the hospital with no furniture except a bed, a table, and a cardboard box she had never opened. The box contained letters from her daughter Sarah, 21 years old, unaware of where her mother had gone or why she had needed to disappear. Katie told herself it was mercy. It was actually cowardice, but mercy sounded better when she whispered it to the dark at 3 in the morning. The intercom crackled. Trauma incoming. Multicar pile up on I-405. ETA 8 minutes. All hands. Katie's hand stilled. The tremor stopped. She moved toward the trauma bays with the kind of smooth precision that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school, from a place she had spent 6 months trying to bury. Her body knew what to do. Her body remembered things her mind had tried very hard to forget. The ER hummed around her, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze from Bay 3, the steady beeping of monitors, the smell of antiseptic layered over something older and deeper, something like copper and rain and dust from a place called Marja where she had learned to stitch human beings back together while bullets went through hospital walls like prayers nobody answered. The fluorescent lights flickered. Katie did not blink. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves. The snap was sharp, almost like the sound of a safety being released. The first ambulance screamed into the bay at 8:16 a.m. A construction worker, 32 years old, 6-inch laceration across his left forearm, bleeding but not arterial, conscious and cursing in Spanish. Katie was already moving before the paramedics finished their report. She guided him to the suturing station with a hand on his shoulder, her voice low and steady. "You're going to be fine. I've seen worse. Much worse." "Do you know what you're doing?" the man asked, his English fractured by pain and fear. "Yes," she said. Not pride. Just fact. The senior resident, Dr. Marcus Chen, was already there. He was competent and kind and had stopped asking Katie questions after the first month. She threaded the needle, 4.0 suture, the gauge small enough for minimal scarring, and began. Her hands moved like they were reading a language written in muscle memory and scar tissue. Over and under. The knots precise. The spacing exactly 3 millimeters apart. The needle moving in a smooth arc, in and out, the kind of rhythm that came from doing this in a field hospital with the sound of artillery rolling across the mountains of Cunha province and a young corpsman bleeding out because the bullet that was supposed to hit Katie had hit him instead. 14 seconds. The entire laceration closed. The wound sealed. Done. Dr. Chen stared at her. "How did you do that so fast?" "Practice," Katie said, stripping off her gloves. Her hands had stopped shaking. This was the only time they ever did. "Where did you train?" "Your resume said Portland Community College nursing program, but that's not." "Will the patient be okay?" Katie interrupted, her voice flat, final. "Yes. Yes, he'll be fine. No permanent damage." That was remarkable. Katie was already moving to the next bay. She did not see Dr. Chen watching her, did not notice the way his eyes narrowed with something like confusion. She had learned a long time ago that being remarkable was how you died. Being invisible was how you survived. The second ambulance brought a woman with a head laceration and 2 broken ribs. Katie assessed her in 90 seconds, stable, responsive, no signs of internal bleeding, and moved her to Bay 2 for X-rays. The third ambulance brought a teenage boy with a compound fracture of the tibia and a femur that needed orthopedic consultation. By the time the fourth ambulance arrived, the ER had collapsed into controlled chaos, the kind of rhythm that existed nowhere else on Earth, where doctors and nurses became a single organism working toward the singular goal of keeping broken people alive. Katie moved through it like she was gliding, like her feet were not quite touching the ground, like she had practiced this exact dance 1,000 times in 1,000 different circumstances. Which she had. The last time had been at FOB Shankin Loga province, with 62 casualties coming in from a convoy ambush and only 4 medical personnel who could help them. That had been 3 years ago. That had been a lifetime ago. That had been the day she decided she could not do it anymore. At 11:15 a.m., while Katie was restocking the trauma cart, she heard the ambulance doors slam. She heard the paramedic calling out vitals, stable, responsive, GSW to the shoulder, entry wound clean, possible exit wound in the lat muscle, patient alert and oriented. She heard the stretcher wheel squeak against the tile floor as they wheeled him toward Bay 1, and then she heard something else. A voice. Male. Rough. Familiar in a way that made her breath catch. I'm okay. I'm okay. Just need it stitched up. Katie froze. The 4 bag she was holding went still in her hands. She turned and looked. The patient was a man in his 50s, dark hair threaded with grey, a tattoo on his neck that was partially hidden by the trauma collar. He had a GSW to the left shoulder and he was looking around the ER with a kind of calm that came from having seen much worse. He was trying to sit up. A paramedic was telling him to hold still. Katie knew that tattoo. She knew the sound of that voice. She had heard it in a cave system outside Marja, calling out coordinates while rounds went through the stone ceiling like rainfall, calling out her name when she thought she was alone, when she thought the blood pooling under her was her own. Corpsman First Class Ethan Graves. Charlie Platoon. Delta Company. Not dead. Not missing. Not in Arlington Cemetery under a flag that said his name and the dates of his life and nothing about what he had actually done, which was save 7 lives in that cave system and then lose his own in the firefight that followed. Except he was not dead. He was right there in Bay 1, alive and conscious and alive and breathing and alive. Katie's hands began to tremble again. She set down the 4 bag very carefully on the metal cart. She could not move. She could not breathe. She could not do any of the things that bodies did when they were confronted with ghosts. Katie. A nurse named Jennifer was standing beside her. Are you okay? You look. I'm fine, Katie said. Her voice sounded very far away, like it was coming from another room, another building, another life entirely. I'm fine. Just need a moment. She turned away. She walked to the supply closet, pushed open the door, and stood in the dark for approximately 43 seconds while her heartbeat returned to a normal rhythm and her breathing returned to something that resembled normal breathing. She pressed her hand against the cool concrete wall. She did not cry. She had not cried in 3 years, and she was not going to start now. When she emerged, her face was calm. Her hands were steady. She looked like a nurse who had simply needed to grab fresh gloves. But she did not go back to Bay 1. She could not. She moved instead to Bay 2, where a woman was waiting for discharge papers, and then to Bay 3, where Dr. Chen was checking on the construction worker whose arm she had stitched. The man looked up at her and smiled. You did good, nurse. Really good. When I get home, I'm going to tell my wife you saved me from looking like a monster. Katie said nothing. She was watching the curtain that separated Bay 2 from Bay 1, listening to the sound of voices, listening for his voice specifically, listening to see if he had recognized her name on the charts or if she was still invisible, still safe, still buried under 6 months of anonymity and careful distance and the kind of loneliness that came from being the only person on Earth who knew where you actually were. The trauma bays hummed with the sound of monitors and ventilators and human voices calling out information in the efficient shorthand of emergency medicine. Katie stood very still in the center of the organized chaos, waiting for the moment when everything changed. And that was when the curtain to Bay 1 moved. A man stepped through. He was older than Katie remembered, silver threading through his dark hair, but his eyes were the same, sharp and military and looking directly at the trauma cart where she was standing. He looked at her face for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked away. He asked Dr. Chen a question about his shoulder. He did not recognize her? She was invisible. But then, as Dr. Chen was leading him back through the curtain, the man paused. His head tilted, just slightly. His eyes came back to her. Not to her face this time. To her hands. To the way her fingers were holding the trauma supplies. To the specific way she was standing, the specific way her shoulders were positioned, the specific way her body held its weight. The way only a person from Marja would know. His mouth opened. Katie turned away before he could speak. She moved toward the medication station. Her hands did not tremble. Her face did not change. But inside her chest, her heart was moving very fast, like it was trying to escape, like it was trying to fly away from the one place it had promised never to return. Behind her, she heard him say something quietly to Dr. Chen. She did not hear what the words were. She did not need to. She already knew. She already knew that her secret was unraveling, that 6 months of invisibility had just been erased in the space of 2 seconds, that somewhere in the personnel files of Oak Creek Memorial, there was now a man who recognized her for what she actually was, and that the only thing standing between her and exposure was the hope that he would do what she would have done in his position. Keep his mouth shut. The fluorescent lights continued their steady buzz overhead. The monitors continued their beeping. The ER continued its dance of controlled chaos. And Katie Morrison continued to work, moving through the hospital like a ghost, like a shadow, like someone who had already died a very long time ago and was simply going through the motions of being alive until the real world caught up with her and remembered what she was. It was, after all, only a matter of time. The betting pool started at 7:30 in the morning, before the patients were even awake. Dr. Hargrove stood in the center of the nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial, Katie's personnel file held up like evidence in a courtroom. 3 medical residents flanked him. 2 other nurses pretended to chart. Everyone could hear him. Everyone was meant to. "I give Morrison here 1 week before she quits," he announced, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who had spent 15 years building a kingdom where no one questioned him. "Any takers?" The silence that followed was the kind that filled rooms when a predator entered. Katie stood at the medication cart 10 feet away, her back to him, her hands organizing 0.5 milligram metoprolol tablets into the automated dispensers. She heard him. Of course she heard him. Her hands continued moving with precision, left hand rotating each tablet, right hand setting the dosage, but her shoulders had straightened just slightly, the way a wire tightens before it snaps. Hargrove wasn't finished. He never was. 6 months of nursing experience and gaps in her background big enough to drive a truck through, he continued, turning his file sideways as though the residents needed to see the blank spaces in her employment history. 3 years unaccounted for, sweetheart. What were you doing? Prison? 2 residents laughed. Small, uncomfortable sounds that died almost immediately, as if their own survival instincts had warned them they'd made a mistake. Katie's hand paused on the next tablet. Just for half a second. Then she continued. She turned to face them, her eyes finding his, and in that moment something shifted in the fluorescent-lit room. The air pressure seemed to change. Hargrove's smile faltered for just a fraction, a millisecond of uncertainty, as though he'd briefly glimpsed something in her expression that reminded him, somewhere in the reptilian part of his brain, that there were people in the world it was unwise to corner. Then Katie took one measured breath through her nose. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye. Not from sadness. From something else entirely. The kind of tear that came when you were using every ounce of discipline you possessed not to break a man in half with your bare hands. She watched it form in her peripheral vision, felt it slide down her cheek, and with her right index finger she wiped it away without ever breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, was devastatingly calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst humanity can offer and learning that survival requires a different kind of violence than the ones that bleed. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor." The room temperature dropped 20 degrees. The residents exchanged glances that carried the particular discomfort of people who had just witnessed a social murder they didn't have the language to understand. One of them looked down at his shoes. Another found sudden interest in his phone. Hargrove's jaw tightened, and Katie saw something flash across his face, not anger, not yet, but recognition. She had just violated an unspoken rule. She had spoken back. She had maintained eye contact. She had not trembled or retreated or given him the satisfaction of visible distress. He had expected submission. What he'd received instead was composure. "Get back to work," he said, his voice carrying an edge now. He turned away from her, but his movements were stiffer, his shoulders higher. The file remained open in his hands. He would be making notes. He was already planning his next move. Katie returned to the medication cart, but her hands moved differently now. The precision remained, but there was something else underneath it, the careful control of someone holding a machine gun by the barrel and pretending it was a walking stick. She had learned that discipline in the mountains of Helmand province. She had learned it watching 17-year-old privates make decisions they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting. She had learned it by becoming the kind of person who could be told to kill and could say no, and could live with the consequences of that refusal for 3 years. The morning shift continued. Patients were seen. Medications were distributed. Vital signs were recorded in the computer system that never asked questions about gaps in employment or why someone's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 18 months training combat medics in field surgery techniques that didn't exist in any civilian nursing program. Then came lunch. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial occupied the basement level, a space with linoleum floors that clicked under rubber-soled shoes and a ceiling of acoustical tiles that had absorbed 30 years of hospital conversations. The smell of institutional food hung in the air, something vaguely chicken-based, mixed with the underlying antiseptic sweetness of places where illness was a constant presence. Katie was carrying her tray from the serving line. Turkey sandwich. Cup of soup. Small garden salad. She moved through the cafeteria with the economical efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate crowded spaces without disturbing the energy around her. She was trying to reach an empty table near the window. Dr. Hargrove was seated at the doctor's table. For seats around it. He was eating alone, reading something on his phone, but his awareness of Katie's entrance had been immediate. His eyes tracked her movement across the cafeteria with the focused attention of a hunter watching prey move through tall grass. She should have taken a different route. She should have eaten in her locker. She should have known. But that was the thing about not showing fear, it made people test you. It made them escalate. As she passed behind his table, his left leg extended infinitesimally. Not enough to create plausible deniability. Just enough. Katie's tray hit the floor at approximately 40 miles per hour. The impact created a sound that echoed through the cafeteria, the sharp crash of ceramic meeting tile, the softer splash of soup spreading across linoleum like a stain that would take hours to fade. Spaghetti scattered across 6 feet of floor. The plastic cup tumbled and spun, shedding ice across the tile. The cafeteria went silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they've just witnessed an act of calculated cruelty, and no one knows which side of the outcome they're supposed to be on. Hargrove didn't apologize. He didn't even look up from his phone. He simply returned to whatever he was reading, his body language indicating that the incident was already forgotten. Just a nurse. Just a tray. Just something that needed to be cleaned up. Katie knelt down. Her hands shook as they moved across the floor, gathering scattered pasta, picking up broken ceramic with her fingers. A piece of the rim cut across her palm, a thin, sharp line that welled with blood almost immediately. She wrapped her hand in a napkin without looking at the wound, continuing to clean. A younger nurse, Rodriguez, moved to help her, but Hargrove snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp. Definitive. A command. Let her handle her own messes, Rodriguez. Rodriguez froze, his hand suspended in mid-reach toward the soup container, and Katie saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the moment where he weighed his own survival against the impulse to help. Survival won. He returned to his seat. Everyone returned to their meals. The only sound was Katie's breathing and the soft scrape of broken ceramic against tile. She finished cleaning. She wrapped the bloody napkin tighter around her palm. She stood up with her empty hands and her humiliation carried silently across her shoulders like a weight someone else had placed there, but she was strong enough to bear. That evening, Katie's apartment was dark when she came home. The place was small, a studio in northeast Portland, anonymous and temporary, the kind of space that someone lived in when they weren't planning to stay long enough to make it a home. Grey walls. Minimal furniture. A single photograph on the nightstand, turned face down, that showed a younger version of herself in dress uniform standing beside a woman who had her eyes, both of them smiling at something that no longer existed. She sat on the edge of her bed without removing her scrubs. The cut on her palm had stopped bleeding somewhere around hour 5 of her shift. She'd covered it with a nitrile glove and continued working. 12 patients. 7 medication rounds. 1 for insertion. 1 patient education session on post-operative care. She'd never faltered. She'd never shown pain. She'd never given Hargrove the satisfaction. But alone in the darkness of her apartment, with the weight of her hidden past pressing down on her shoulders like a soldier's load, Katie Morrison understood something with absolute clarity. This was only the beginning. Hargrove had made a public bet. He'd made a social statement. He'd already started testing her limits, and he would continue testing them until he found a breaking point. That was how men like him operated. They were territorial. They were threatened by people who couldn't be intimidated. And they had patience, the terrible, methodical patience of men who had spent their entire careers building systems that protected them from consequences. She pulled the turned-over photograph toward her and looked at the younger woman in dress uniform, the one who had made an oath and kept it even when keeping it meant walking away from everything. The one who had learned that some burdens couldn't be shared, that some secrets had to be carried alone, that some pasts were heavy enough to define the rest of your life. Katie set the photograph down again, face down. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new medications, new opportunities for Hargrove to remind her that she didn't belong here. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she sat in the darkness and did what she'd learned to do better than anything else in the world. She endured. And somewhere in the hospital, in a trauma bay being prepared for incoming patients, the automated systems were already printing intake forms for a Friday night that would spiral into chaos. A former combat medic would arrive with a shoulder wound that would trigger a recognition neither of them could afford. An ambulance radio would crackle with a new arrival, a deaf retired Army Ranger, vitals deteriorating, wearing combat boots that no one understood the significance of. But that wasn't the worst part. The ambulance radio crackled at 11:48 p.m. on a Friday that had already torn the hospital apart. Incoming, male, 70s, deaf, retired Army Ranger, vitals unstable. Respiratory distress. Oxygen saturation falling. Dr. Hargrove happened to be working trauma that night, which meant Katie Morrison held her breath the moment she heard his name called over the intercom. The Ranger arrived on a stretcher like a man drowning in air. His chest heaved with the irregular gasping of someone whose body was betraying him, and his eyes, sharp, alert despite the panic, searched the faces around him for translation. Nobody signed. Nobody tried. The ER team moved in their practice dance of efficiency, cutting away his jacket, attaching monitors, running saline lines with the practice speed of people who'd done this 1,000 times. But Katie watched his face. She watched how his left side of his chest rose and fell while his right side barely moved at all. Asymmetric. Wrong. Dr. Hargrove arrived in his white coat like a general entering a war room, already reaching conclusions. He scanned the vitals, the monitors, the Ranger's struggling face, and his diagnosis came out in the flat certainty of a man who'd never been questioned successfully. Pneumonia. Bilateral respiratory infection. Standard protocol, broad-spectrum antibiotics, supplemental oxygen, monitoring. His orders came rapid and authoritative. Within 20 minutes, the Ranger was moved to a standard floor room, and for running antibiotics into his vein, an oxygen mask over his face, the mask that would make signing impossible, that would cut off his only means of communication. Katie followed the stretcher. She couldn't explain why. She'd learned long ago not to trust her own instincts when they contradicted a physician, especially not one like Hargrove. But something in her chest, something carved into her by 17 years of combat medicine, by learning to read bodies the way other people read books, was screaming that this was wrong. The ranger's room was the bayed anonymity of every hospital floor in America. Fluorescent panels hummed their electric lullaby overhead. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The oxygen concentrator wheezed like a sleeping animal. And the combat boots, worn leather the color of sand and dust, bearing the scars of 1,000-mile hikes through terrain that wanted him dead, sat on the floor beside the bed, abandoned like someone had cut him off mid-sentence. Katie stood in the doorway for exactly 90 seconds. The ranger's eyes found her. He tried to move his lips to form words, but the oxygen mask prevented it. His hands made small, frustrated movements. He wanted to communicate. Desperately. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the hallway behind her, moving past without acknowledgement, without a glance. Katie made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She stepped into the room and quietly closed the door. "I know this is hard," she said, speaking slowly so he could read her lips. "I'm going to get you something that helps." She pulled out her phone. Downloaded an ASL app. The interface was clunky, amateur, full of the robotic movements of computer-generated hands. But it was something. For the next 40 minutes, during her shift break, Katie Morrison sat beside a deaf Army Ranger and learned to sign like someone whose hands had been trained to save lives, not communicate across silence. The Ranger's name was Marcus. 73 years old. Marja, 2009 through 2011. 3 tours. He was watching Katie's face as she moved her hands, trying to mirror the shapes. She was faster than the app. She was learning. And somewhere in the second hour of that 5-hour vigil, Marcus's eyes, which had been clouded with panic and medication, began to clear. He signed about his daughter. She lived in Seattle. Hadn't called in for years. He signed about the boots. Said he wore them every day. They grounded him. Made him feel the earth. When you can't hear the world, you have to feel it, he explained in slow, deliberate signs. Katie understood that in the language of someone who'd learned to read silence the way soldiers read terrain. His oxygen saturation registered 87% on the monitor. Declining steadily despite the supplemental O2 flowing at 12 liters per minute. Normal was 95. Above 90 was acceptable. But the trajectory was wrong. The trend was a descent. Katie asked permission to examine the boots. Marcus nodded. She lifted them carefully, leather still warm from sitting beside the heating vent, and inspected them with the methodical attention of someone looking for evidence. The boots were built for function, not appearance. Steel shank in the sole. Ankle support that had been reinforced with duct tape and replacement stitching. And then her fingers found it, a particular pressure point on the upper right boot, near the corresponding chest wall, where the leather had worn away at the seam. She applied gentle pressure to that exact spot on his chest, palpating beneath the ribs. Marcus's entire body went rigid. His hand flew up to stop her. His eyes watered. That was the moment Katie Morrison's combat training eclipsed her nursing hierarchy. That pressure point, that referred pain radiating from a specific location, told her something the CT scans had missed. Something no radiologist would catch if they were looking for infection instead of mechanics. Pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. Air trapped in the pleural space. His left lung was being compressed by his own internal pressure, and every breath he took made it worse. Not pneumonia. Collapse. The distinction meant the difference between antibiotics and death. Katie's hand moved to the monitor. Oxygen saturation at 84%. His respiratory rate climbing to 32 breaths per minute. The blue tint was beginning at his lips, cyanosis creeping in like a shadow. She had maybe 40 minutes before he arrested. She found Dr. Hargrove in the doctor's lounge on the second floor. He was sitting with two other physicians, coffee in hand, reviewing a tablet. She waited until he looked up. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady as surgical steel. The Ranger in for 12. His presentation isn't consistent with pneumonia. Hargrove's eyes flickered with annoyance. Isn't it? Asymmetric chest rise. Unilateral oxygen desaturation despite supplemental O2. He's compensating. The scans missed a tension pneumothorax because you read his boots. Hargrove set down his coffee with deliberate slowness. The other physicians had gone very still. Did I ask for your diagnosis, Katie? Did I request your clinical assessment? His oxygen is at 84 and falling. We need to decompress. What we need, Hargrove said, standing, is for nurses to follow orders instead of practicing medicine they're not licensed for. He's old. He's deaf. He's disoriented. And he has a respiratory infection. Each word landed like a fist. I've written the orders. Antibiotics. Monitoring. That's the protocol. That's what's happening. Katie's jaw tightened. She could feel it, the pressure building behind her teeth, the old training rising up like something with claws. But she kept her voice level. I'd like permission to do a more thorough exam. To rule out. No. Hargrove stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to hurt someone quietly. You will follow my orders exactly as written, or you will follow them from the unemployment line. You understand me? Katie nodded once. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her shake. She walked back to the Ranger's room at 1:23 a.m. The monitor showed 81% oxygen saturation. His lips had turned the color of old bruises. His breathing had taken on the desperate, irregular quality of a man whose body was running out of options. Katie pulled a stool close to his bed and didn't leave. The next 4 hours became a masterclass in helplessness. She monitored his vitals on the screen while sitting beside him in the dark. She helped him drink water. She adjusted his oxygen mask when it slipped. She learned more sign language from the app, her hands moving faster now, the shapes becoming muscle memory. And she watched the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping across its face like an executioner's blade, while his oxygen saturation continued its slow descent. At 2:51 a.m., it dropped to 79%. At 3:15 a.m., his respiratory rate hit 38 breaths per minute. The monitor began showing irregular patterns. Compensatory breathing. The body's final rebellion. Katie knew what was coming. She'd seen it before. In Marja. In field hospitals. In rooms just like this one where the only difference between living and dying was 12 seconds and the right decision. She made a choice that would echo through the next 72 hours of her life. Katie Morrison stood up, walked to the medication cabinet in the Ranger's room, and pulled out the sterile kit for needle decompression. Her hands moved with the precision of muscle memory, of training that went deeper than law, deeper than hospital protocol, deeper than fear. 14-gauge needle. Decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done this 17 times in her life. She'd never failed. But this time, before she could break the seal on the sterile package, alarms began to scream. The heart monitor flatlined into the white noise of arrest. And every nurse on the floor came running. The monitor's shriek cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade. 81%. Katie's eyes locked onto the oxygen saturation number as it ticked downward, 80, 79, and the Ranger's lips had already begun their transformation to blue. Not the gentle blue of exhaustion. The desperate blue of arrest. She'd seen this color before in Marja. She knew exactly how many seconds remained. Katie moved into the room without breaking stride, her body shifting into the precision that 3 combat tours had carved into her muscle memory. No hesitation. No doubt. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands, steady as surgical lasers, went to the emergency decompression kit on the crash cart. The ranger's eyes tracked her with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned to read everything in a face because he couldn't hear the panic in voices. She signed with one hand while preparing with the other, "I'm helping. Trust me." He nodded once. A warrior's nod. The anatomy was identical to every human body she'd saved in the field. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle, 14 gauge, gleaming under the harsh lights, went in at a 45-degree angle. She felt the subtle resistance of skin, the give of muscle, and then the membrane that separated life from cardiac arrest. The hiss came like a sigh of relief. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound that meant she'd read the boots correctly, the tension pneumothorax correctly, the failure of every attending physician's diagnostic acumen correctly. The ranger gasped. His color flooded back in seconds, not gradually, but immediate and profound. The oxygen saturation began its climb, 85%, 88, 92. His eyes met Katie's and held them, and she saw the recognition there of someone who understood that he'd just been handed back his life by someone who knew exactly how to do it. She signed, "You're okay now." He signed back, fingers shaking, "Thank you." 30 seconds. That was all it took for Dr. Hargrove to burst through the door, alerted by the monitors screaming their return to normalcy. His face underwent a transformation more dramatic than the ranger's oxygen saturation, from his usual shade of expensive confidence to a purple that matched the bruise on his ego. His eyes locked on the decompression needle still in place, on Katie's hand still positioned in the aftermath of intervention, and his voice emerged low and lethal. "You just ended your career." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact as far as he was concerned. Katie didn't respond. She simply finished what she'd started, checking the needle's position, verifying the hiss had fully released the tension. Professional. Methodical. The kind of composure that infuriated him more than any argument could have. "Security," Hargrove barked into his phone before he'd even finished the sentence. "Now." Katie watched him leave, phone already pressed to his ear, and she knew. Not hope, not fear, a knowledge. The kind that came from understanding how institutional power worked, how people like Hargrove weaponized it once they felt threatened. The first stage had been humiliation. The second had been establishing his dominance. Now came escalation. Security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 officers, both uncomfortable, both aware that something wasn't adding up but following protocol anyway. Katie didn't resist when they asked her to step away from the room. She simply removed her gloves, disposed of them in the red bin with the same precision she'd used for the needle, and walked between them like she was walking to a firing squad. The nurses on the floor watched in silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. By that evening, Dr. Hargrove was on his phone, not from his office, not waiting for business hours, but from his weekend vacation home upstate where he'd been planning to spend Saturday fishing. The board members who answered their phones during their weekend retreats heard the same story from slightly different angles: an unauthorized procedure, reckless endangerment, questions about credentials, questions about where Katie Morrison had actually received her training. He had the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years building exactly the right network, the kind of network that answered phones when people like him called, the kind that remembered favors. By Sunday, he'd tracked down her references. There were only 3. A supervisor from a clinic in Seattle who said Katie had worked there 8 months and done excellent work but had been quiet about her background. A charge nurse from a facility in Spokane with similar observations. And a training program director from a nursing school in Portland who confirmed enrollment and graduation but nothing beyond that. 3 professional endorsements that proved nothing about the 3 years before, the 3 years she'd spent recovering from things she couldn't name to people she couldn't tell. Hargrove's investigators, hired by Tuesday morning, expensive ones who'd worked for the hospital before, were tasked with a simple question: where exactly had Katie Morrison been from 2018 to 2021? Medical records? None. Tax returns? Sparse. Employment history? Non-existent. It was the kind of absence that invited suspicion, the kind that a man like Hargrove could weaponize into something that looked like legitimate concern. By Monday morning, the call came at 8 a.m. Katie's nursing license was suspended pending investigation. The hospital's legal team cited credential verification discrepancies and unauthorized invasive procedures. The investigation could take weeks. Or months. Or might never reach a conclusion at all. The point wasn't resolution, it was erasure. It was the slow institutional machinery that turned someone like Katie into a liability, and once you were a liability, you became invisible. Katie had stayed in her car in the hospital parking lot for 2 hours after security walked her out. She'd sat with both hands on the steering wheel, watching the building through the windshield, watching the people moving through the lobby like ants in a colony. She'd wanted to scream. She'd wanted to drive to wherever Hargrove lived and do something that would have violated every protocol she'd honored for 23 years. Instead, she'd started the engine and driven home, still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and her own sweat. The kitchen table was where she'd always worked through problems, the place that had become her substitute for a therapist she couldn't afford and wouldn't trust anyway. The termination notice sat in front of her, pages and pages of institutional language that translated to a single sentence, "You don't belong here." She'd read it 4 times. Now she sat staring at nothing, her hands folded on top of the pages, when Sarah came through the door. Sarah was 24, working as a graphic designer for a tech firm downtown, and she'd never seen her mother cry. Not after the car accident 15 years ago when her father died. Not during any of the silences that Katie had developed into something almost like an art form. Not once in the 6 months since Katie had appeared at her apartment with a duffel bag and a request to stay for a while, a request that had extended into permanent residence, into this house, into this life that Katie had constructed on nothing but careful omission and harder boundaries. Sarah's eyes went to Katie's face first, then to the hospital letterhead on the table, then back to her mother's face. "Mom, why are you home early?" Katie couldn't answer. The question was too simple for the complexity it contained. Early wasn't the problem. Early was a symptom of something deeper, something that had been waiting to surface from the moment she'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial 6 months ago. Sarah sat down, her confusion transforming slowly into fear as her eyes tracked the language on the pages: unauthorized procedure, investigation, suspension pending termination. "Mom, what's happening?" Katie could only shake her head. The tears came regardless of protocol, regardless of training, regardless of everything she'd learned about compartmentalization and survival. They came because her daughter was asking questions that required answers Katie had never prepared to give, and because the ranger was alive at his kitchen table somewhere in Portland signing to someone about the woman who'd saved his life just before his savior got disappeared by the machine that was supposed to keep him safe. Sarah reached across the table and took her mother's hands. Katie didn't pull away. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed confused and worried and asking questions that Katie had deflected with the kind of gentle firmness that had kept them distant for years, Katie sat alone in the dark of the living room. Her phone chimed. A text from an unknown number, the kind that required translation because it came through an app for deaf communication. "You saved my life. I won't forget." The ranger. Someone had helped him send the message. Katie read it again and again, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that the life she'd built on anonymity and careful erasure had just collided with the life she'd tried to bury, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to be the same again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was about to arrive at 8:36 in the morning, on a Wednesday, with rotor wash and boots and the sound of institutional machinery turning itself on for people like her. Wednesday morning at 08 for 7 hours, the rotor wash hit the parking lot like God slamming a fist against the earth. The blades of the UH-60M Black Hawk beat the air into submission, bending the tops of the Douglas firs that surrounded Oak Creek Memorial, scattering leaves and gravel in concentric waves. The sound was percussion, the kind that lived in your chest and didn't leave. Katie was in the break room when the windows started to rattle. Then the alarms went silent. Not the medical alarms. The building alarms. The institutional kind. The ones that meant something official was happening. Something outside the normal chain of command. Two army officers in dress uniforms walked through the main entrance like they owned the place. Class A's, pressed sharp enough to draw blood. The kind of uniform that made hospital policy disappear. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of men who had spent decades walking into rooms and being obeyed. They didn't ask where Administrator Wells was. They walked toward his office as if they'd memorized the map. Nurses parted. Orderlies stopped their carts. The building's normal current reversed itself. Katie's daughter Sarah had followed the commotion from the waiting room. She stood in the hallway, watching the officers disappear into the administrative wing. Her phone was already out, texting, "Mom, what's happening?" Katie didn't respond. She was standing very still in the break room, a coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the training. That was what 15 years of service looked like when you compressed it into bone and muscle and the neural pathways that refused to let fear show on a face. The first officer pushed through the administrator's office door. His name tag read Colonel Mitchell, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Behind him came a two-star general whose uniform hung on him like authority-made fabric. His jaw was set like a closing fist. Administrator Wells looked up from his desk, and the color drained from his face the way blood drains from a wound before shock sets in. "We're here for Senior Chief Morrison," Colonel Mitchell said. Not a request. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed before he finished speaking. "We need her. Now." The words rippled through the hospital like shockwaves through water. Senior Chief. Senior Chief Morrison. Not Katie. Not the shy nurse from the 6th floor. Not the woman who kept her eyes down and her head lower. The words hung in the air and Sarah felt her knees soften. She'd been standing outside the office when the general walked past, and she'd heard it. Senior Chief. The color drained from her own face now, matching the administrator's. She knew that rank. She didn't know what it meant attached to her mother, but she knew it meant something. In the break room, Katie set down her coffee cup with the kind of care you'd use setting down a grenade pin. Then she walked out. Not rushed. Walking like someone walking toward a reckoning they'd been preparing for their entire life. Behind her, two nurses whispered. One of them said, "Is she in trouble?" The other one said nothing. That was the thing about Katie Morrison. No one ever knew if she was in trouble or if trouble had just made a very significant mistake. The administrator's office was full now. Word had spread through Oak Creek Memorial like fire through dry wood. Staff had drifted into the hallway, standing silent, watching. A trembling nurse stood with a file folder, her hand shaking so badly the papers inside were rattling against each other like leaves. The two-star general took the file from her hands and opened it. He read aloud, each word placed with the weight of a gavel, 3 combat tours. 15 commendations. Surgical trauma specialist. He paused. He let that land. Navy Cross. Another pause. The hallway was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming through the walls. 2 silver stars. Another pause. Longer this time. You could hear someone's badge clinking against their stethoscope down the hall. You could hear the fluorescent panel overhead making its electrical whisper. Promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer, March 2019, for Valor in Combat Operations. Dr. Hargrove stood in the back corner of the office, and his face was the color of raw meat. His jaw worked like he was trying to form words that had no shape. He'd built 15 years of authority on the foundation of Katie's invisibility. He'd built his empire on small humiliations of people he believed were beneath him. And he'd just watched the ground beneath that empire open like a sinkhole. Katie stood in the doorway, still in her scrubs, and her composure held like steel. She didn't acknowledge the file. She didn't acknowledge the general. She just looked at the administrator and waited. That was when things moved very fast. Administrator Wells stood up, and his voice had changed. It was the voice of someone calculating odds at lightning speed. Newspapers. Lawsuits. Federal oversight. A decorated military veteran was fired from a hospital. A patient was nearly killed by a physician's arrogance. And a nurse had been destroyed for correcting a mistake. Dr. Hargrove, Wells said, and the words were final as a closing casket, "You are suspended effective immediately pending a full review." The room held its breath. Hargrove opened his mouth. He didn't recognize this version of himself yet, the version that was already finished. "You can't do this," he said. His voice cracked. His voice actually cracked. "I've been here 15 years. But his words landed in a room full of people who had just heard the words Navy Cross. 15 years of service meant something different when it was Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. 15 years of service meant you'd seen things and done things that most people spent their lives trying not to think about. The general stepped forward. He moved like a man who had kicked doors open in places with names nobody could pronounce. "Dr. Hargrove," he said, and his voice was parade ground loud, the kind of volume that turned space into a weapon. "You endangered the life of a decorated combat veteran through arrogance and negligence. You then attempted to destroy the career of the woman who corrected your mistake." He paused. "If this were my command, you'd face a court-martial." Outside, someone had called the news. Of course they had. Someone always did. Katie could hear the sound of vans pulling into the parking lot, the distant wail of satellite trucks finding their signal. Rolling news cameras. The kind of coverage that doesn't forget. Administrator Wells looked at Hargrove, and you could see the calculation finish itself in his eyes. The only direction forward was through public accountability. He walked toward the lobby, and Hargrove followed like a man being led to execution. The lobby doors opened onto a wall of camera crews. Lights blazed. Reporters started shouting questions before anyone had said anything. Wells stepped into that light with Hargrove beside him, and the general stood behind them like a promise of consequences. Wells' voice was steady, effective immediately. "Dr. James Hargrove is terminated from Oak Creek Memorial for gross negligence and abuse of authority." The words hit the cameras and spread outward like a stone hitting still water, and Katie watched from the hallway, her daughter's hand finding hers. Sarah's grip was so tight it cut off circulation, but Katie didn't pull away. This was the moment her mother stopped being invisible. Hargrove's face went crimson. The veins in his neck bulged like cords. His mouth opened and opened again, but no sound came out that mattered. The general stepped forward, and his voice carried over everything. "The United States Army stands with Senior Chief Morrison. Any institution that doesn't recognize her valor isn't worthy of her service." The cameras loved it. The reporters loved it. The staff of Oak Creek Memorial who had watched Katie get humiliated in the cafeteria, who had said nothing, who had let it happen, they stood silent now, and some of them looked ashamed. 6 months later, Katie stood in a hospital boardroom while they officially reinstated her. But they didn't just reinstate her. They promoted her. Chief of Emergency Medicine. The position came with a corner office and windows that faced east, and an official apology from Administrator Wells that he read from a statement while the board members nodded. The combat medic from the ER gave testimony about her surgical technique. The ranger, through his interpreter, described the 5 hours Katie had spent learning to sign, learning to listen in a different language because that's what the patient needed. Sarah sat in the front row and cried. After the hearing, in the hallway, Sarah asked the question that had been building for 6 months, "Why didn't you tell me?" Katie's answer was quiet, the way the most important things usually are. "Because I was trying to forget. And I wasn't ready to be that person anymore." Sarah hugged her, and Katie felt her daughter's tears against her shoulder. "You never stopped being that person, Mom. You just needed to remember it yourself." 3 weeks after that, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove in a community college gymnasium teaching CPR to a class of 12 students for minimum wage. His face was haggard. His voice was subdued. When a student asked where he'd worked before, he changed the subject quickly. The same hands that had once thrown Katie's charts across a room were now pressing on a mannequin's ribs, demonstrating chest compressions with the precision of someone who no longer had the authority to demand anything else. Katie's new office at Oak Creek Memorial had windows that caught the morning light. Sunlight streamed across her desk in geometric blocks of gold and shadow. On the wall behind her, in a shadow box with museum-quality glass, sat a pair of worn Army Ranger combat boots. The leather was creased and scarred and real. An engraved brass plate on the base of the box read, "To the one who listened when no one else would." When Sarah visited during lunch, she asked about them. Katie told her the whole story, 5 hours bent over a patient learning a language she'd never spoken, discovering that pain was data and pressure points could reveal what scans had missed, making the choice to act knowing it would cost everything she'd tried to build. Sarah touched the glass. "You gave up everything to save him," she said. Katie shook her head. "I gave up nothing. I remembered who I was." The Ranger himself came to visit, moving without the oxygen tubes that had haunted him for so long. Through his interpreter, he told Katie he'd started a foundation. Trained medical professionals in deaf patient care. He wanted her to speak at a medical conference. To be the keynote speaker for 200 doctors and nurses. Katie hesitated. Speaking meant recognition. Recognition meant the opposite of the anonymity she'd spent years hunting. But she said yes. At the conference, standing before those 200 people in a room with perfect acoustics and professional lighting, Katie held her Navy Cross in one hand and the microphone in the other. She started speaking, and her voice was the voice of someone who had finally stopped hiding. 6 months ago, I was trying to disappear. I thought healing meant hiding. A deaf patient taught me that healing means showing up, even when you're terrified, even when no one believes in you, even when the cost is everything you've built. Sarah sat in the third row, tears running freely. The Ranger sat beside her, signing along with every word. In the back, 3 nurses from Oak Creek Memorial who had watched the humiliation in silence, they watched Katie reclaim her voice. She placed the Navy Cross on the podium. "Not all heroes wear capes," she said. "Some wear scrubs. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. Subscribe. Like. Comment. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together."